Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today I'm so excited to have John and Julie Gottman on the podcast. And they're phenomenal. You may have heard of their research and their books and so forth. John Gottman is a leading research scientist on marriage and family. He's co-founder of the Gottman Institute and Effective Software. He's the author of more than 200 professional journal articles and 48 books, and a recipient of numerous awards for his contribution to marriage and family research. Julie Gottman is co-founder and president of the Gottman Institute and co-founder of Effective Software, and she's co-creator of the Gottman Sound Relationship House Theory and Gottman Method Couples Therapy. Julie is a clinical psychologist and expert advisor to international media and other organizations on marriage, sexual harassment and rape, PTSD, domestic violence, gay and lesbian adoption, and other topics. John and Julie, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Stephan.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, so first of all, I think we should probably talk a little bit about some of the most foundational stuff that you guys are known for, and I'm thinking like the Four Horsemen and micro expressions and how to make sure that you keep your relationship going. So maybe we could kind of dive in right there with that.
Okay. Well, let's begin with some of our research findings. So we studied, mostly John and his wonderful colleague, Robert Levinson at the University of California, Berkeley, studied over 3,000 couples by bringing them into a lab, either a typical lab setting or an apartment lab where they stayed for 24 hours. And the couples were videotaped having conversations about everyday events and conversations about conflict. And they were also physiologically measured for heart rate, for how much they perspired in their skin, a variety of other measures, to detect whether or not there was some physiological arousal present in either partner, particularly when they were discussing conflict. And that physiological arousal proved to be very, very significant. Let me tell you a little bit about the findings. First of all, they found that healthy couples during conflict had 5 times as many positive responses to each other as 1 negative. So 5 to 1 was a big ratio that really indicated people were more positive than negative, even during conflict. Right. And during non-conflict times, it was 20 positive interactions to 1 negative. So the healthiest relationships were a climate of positivity, overwhelmingly so. We also found that couples who were not doing very well, who were really distressed, showed what we call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse during their interactions, especially the conflict interactions. And that predicted 5 or 6 years down the road some real troubles, if not divorce and separation. So let me tell you what those 4 are. The first one is criticism. And by criticism, what we mean is blaming a problem on a personality flaw of the partner. For example, you're so lazy, you're so thoughtless. Criticisms like that, or why did you say that mean thing? Even words like always or never, when they were attached to something negative, meant something critical was being said. The antidote the healthy couples to criticism did was speaking about themselves, describing their own feelings, the situation, and their own needs, rather than aiming their criticism at the partner. Secondly, contempt was a huge predictor of divorce or separation, and contempt meant criticism from a superior point of view, really looking down your nose at your partner. We saw sarcasm, mockery, calling somebody a bad name. Those were forms of contempt. And they not only predicted terrible dysfunction in the relationship, they also predicted how many infectious illnesses the listener would get in the coming few years. In other words, contempt directly predicted a dampening of the immune system, which these days, of course, is a very serious concern given we have COVID out there. The third horseman was defensiveness. And defensiveness is probably the hardest one to overcome. John and I practice defensiveness as much as possible, which is a problem. We have to always work on it.
Right.
So defensiveness means either counterattacking when you feel attacked, saying something like, oh yeah, well, you didn't pay the bills, or kind of a whining, not taking responsibility for something, which would sound like, I did too pay the bills. So, whining and not taking responsibility for the problem is defensiveness, and the antidote is to take responsibility for the problem. The last horseman that was really interesting and tied to physiology was what we call stonewalling. And what stonewalling means is shutting down all of your responses when you're sitting with your partner and your partner is trying to have a conversation with you. And it's not just for a few seconds, it's probably for a few minutes or even longer. And what we discovered was that oftentimes people who were stonewalling, who'd shut down and not said a word back to their partner, not even looked at their partner, inside, their bodies were in fight or flight. Their heart rates were over 100 beats a minute. Their blood pressure was higher. They couldn't think straight. They couldn't creatively problem solve.
Right.
This is all a condition that goes along with being in fight or flight, or what we call flooding. So those were some of the big research findings.
Wow, those are amazing. And there's one other piece that I think is important to bring to the surface, and that is the importance of bids.
Mm-hmm. Right. You want to talk about that, John?
Yeah. So in the apartment lab, what we found when people were just hanging out together, that quite often one person would try to get the other person's attention or interest and might say something to connect emotionally, like, hey, look at that. That's a beautiful boat going by. Because the lab was on the Montlake Cut in Seattle. And the camera operator would immediately switch one of the cameras to the partner to see what the response was. And what we found was when there was no response, which we call turning away, that was a really bad sign. And a lot of times people just they weren't aware of the fact that this is important to really respond. But we found later on, when a lot of the newlyweds had divorced 6 years later, when we looked back 6 years earlier at their day in the apartment lab, on average, they were responding to their partner's bids by turning toward, giving some response, an average of 33% of the time. Whereas the couples who were still together 6 years after the wedding, when we look back, their average was 86% of turning toward bids. So we realized that turning toward your partner's need for emotional connection is building kind of an emotional bank account in the relationship. That's really critical.
Yeah. So if I say to my wife, for example, oh, check out those lizards, they look like they're staring at each other, for her to respond positively and say, oh yeah, that's pretty cute. That's important to the health of the relationship and to our ongoing connection.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's really the sort of indirect way we let our partner know in the moment what we need. And so to turn away from that or ignore it or be irritable when your partner asks for something, which we call turning against, is really destructive to the long haul of the relationship.
Yeah. And you guys are very good at noticing micro expressions. Just a fleeting microsecond of contempt or criticism or disgust, even worse, right?
Right. Right.
That is very indicative that in years to come, that couple won't be together.
Yeah, that's right. So when we zero in on facial expressions and just, turn the sound down and just code what the face is doing objectively, those sort of momentary flashes of disgust or contempt or anger that often don't have words attached to them really have an impact on the relationship. And you're still accumulating negativity in the relationship when you do that. Um, and it's much better to really take those expressions and use them as a way to talk about what you feel and what you need with your partner so your partner can respond to them and really try to give you what you need.
Yeah. Now, would you guys say that we all have an emotional bank account and that we're either making deposits and withdrawals depending on our behaviors towards the other?
Yeah, that's a perfect description, as a matter of fact. And again, if you go back to that ratio of 5 to 1 or 20
Yeah.
to 1 during non-conflict times of positive to negative, what you want to be doing, especially with bids for connection, is just piling the positivity. It's like gold coins, doubloons into the bank account so that when you mess up, and you hurt your partner's feelings, okay, there's a withdrawal from the bank account, but you've got so much positivity to counterbalance that you're still doing okay. There's still money in the bank.
Yeah,
Right.
awesome. And what do you think of the concept or feel about the concept of a soulmate?
Well, if you think about somebody having, I don't know, if you look around the world's population, which is now about 7.5 billion people, I'd say each person probably has at least 1,000 soulmates, and there is no such thing as a real, when people talk about a soulmate or a twin flame or something like that, typically what they're really talking about is somebody who's almost a clone of themselves, who's so similar to who they are that they imagine there'll be no conflict, and everything will ride smoothly into the sunset. But the reality is that every person has their own delightful, unique, and sometimes very annoying idiosyncrasies. And those characteristics that make us who we are wonderful and unique. And so you're going to find somebody, it's like pieces of a puzzle. If you think of yourself as multifaceted, you may find somebody that fits very nicely into 3 out of 10 of those facets. 4 out of the remaining ones are kind of mediocre, and then there's 2 or 3 that are horrific. And you have to deal with that, right? That's where conflicts come from, especially the ones that last forever, perpetual problems. Was another research finding we had where 69% of problems that couples struggle with are perpetual problems. They never go away. And you have to learn how to talk about them, just dialogue about them, accept the differences in your partner. It's neither good nor bad. It's just that you're different based on either personality differences or lifestyle choices, lifestyle preferences. And that's okay. That's part of what provides the juice in a relationship, that makes it spicy, that makes it interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I have this great definition of a soulmate that I read. It's from Edgar Casey, who is a clairvoyant from maybe
Right.
80 or 100 years ago.
Yeah. What did he say?
He said that a soulmate is an ongoing connection with another individual that the soul picks up again in various times and places over lifetimes. And we're attracted to another person at a soul level, not because that person is our unique complement, but because by being with that individual, we are somehow provided with an impetus to become whole ourselves.
Wow.
Ooh, that's very nice.
That's interesting.
Very good.
So we talk about the good enough relationship rather than the relationship. And, we're not attracted to our clones. We're attracted to people who are very different from us. Especially women are attracted to men who are really different from them in their immune system genes, the major histocompatibility complex. So that's really interesting, and it is research done by a German scientist, Klaus Wedekind. It hasn't perfectly replicated, but I think the finding is true that there is no algorithm that can predict who you're going to like and who you're going to be attracted to. But we're certainly not attracted to a replica of ourselves. And we're not attracted to people who are like us, like our brother or sister. We tend to be attracted to people who we haven't been raised with, who are very different and very interesting. And the mistake is to then try to create them to be more like us, rather than enjoying and reveling in the differences that make our life together really interesting. Julie's very different from me.
That's where I was going.
Okay.
Good for you. I was just going to say, a classic example is John and me. So we are so different in so many ways. So John likes to think of himself as an indoorsman. He has a red leather chair. He loves to sit in the red leather chair all day and read math and physics. While my ideal activity, I'm an outdoors person, I guess, woman, and I love to climb mountains. So John also loves the sea, which is terrific. So what do we do together? He's not going to climb a mountain with me, and I don't want to sit around all day. So what are we going to do together? Well, we found the perfect activity for us, which included sitting. We sit in a kayak, paddle out into the sea, and look at nature. Right. And John doesn't get dirty, and it's perfect. And he's still sitting, and we can talk and we can enjoy the outdoors without much strain. And it's a delightful experience.
We really enjoy each other's company. I think that's the basic thing. I hike with her too, but climbing mountains is something there's not a cell in my body that wants to do that.
Yeah. I'm guessing you're not a camper either.
Yeah. Wants to go up to Mount Everest base camp, and wow, a big difference between us. And yet, we've really learned from each other's differences and learned to enjoy them.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. What do you think of the concept of, or this idea, this belief that soulmates choose each other before they incarnate?
Well, first of all, you have to believe in reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. Two, you have to believe that we actually have a choice of who we come into the next life as. So there's a whole bunch of beliefs in there that are really, really interesting. I have no idea whether they're true. Maybe, maybe not. It's very hard for us to fully think that people are going to choose who they partner with when we've got domestic violence, we've got horrific dysfunctional relationships, we have betrayals, we have criminal activity, we have people who are so very, very sad together. So have they chosen also? If so, that seems a little self-destructive. So, I'm really not sure. I tend to maybe believe in reincarnation to some degree, but I guess I'll find out. I'm now 70. I'll find out in maybe 30 years.
Or 40 or 50.
We hope.
Yeah, and so in Judaism, they teach that to look for or to see the hand of God in absolutely anything and everything. including domestic violence and horrible atrocities and everything. Like, the hand of God is in all of it. And so I'm curious what your take on that is, both of you.
Go for it. I'll be right back.
One of the beliefs that Judaism really promulgated was that in order to be close to God, one should live a life of ethics and justice and mercy and charity and compassion. And so, it's absolutely true that we need to have compassion for people who are violent at times. We have to understand that, and help them with that. But people do have a responsibility for the evil they do perpetrate themselves. And so once a year, we look inside ourselves and, really try to change so that we're closer to God, try to return to God and live a life of morality and ethics and kindness and compassion. And, nobody's perfect. So, we need that sort of course correction at least once a year. Hopefully even more than once a year, if we're really thoughtful. So, it's true that we need to face the fact that the world isn't perfect and have compassion for people who do, make wrong choices and perpetrate racism and sexism and the lack of kindness. But we also have to take responsibility for the things that we do to hurt other people as well.
Very true, very true. And in regards to, let's take the topic of domestic violence specifically. What do you guys see as the kind of the escape plan for somebody who's being abused? How do they see it, recognize it? How do they seek help? And how do they execute on it without falling into mortal danger?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good question, Stephen. First of all, let me just introduce a little bit of nuance into the topic of domestic violence. So other researchers, as well as we, have found that there's two types of domestic violence. What we call situational domestic violence does not cause major injury. There is not a clear perpetrator and victim. Both people tend to be violent. The violence usually occurs as a result of an escalated quarrel, and both people take responsibility for their own violence. So it might be a push, a shove, a slap, something like that. And they're both doing that when they're out of control. So what's happening in those situations is that they are, again, physiologically flooded.
Right.
They flip their lid, so to speak, as our beloved friend, Dr. Daniel Siegel would say. And they can't think straight, can't problem solve, and so they just simply react to each other, and sometimes that includes physical violence. Now, that's about 80% of the population of domestically violent couples. The other 20% consists of people we call characterologically domestically violent. Those people have a clear perpetrator and victim. Most of the violence is committed by a man on a woman. The woman can do nothing to stop the violence. The violence is used to intimidate and control and create fear in the partner. There is major injury. There is mortal danger. And the perpetrator takes no responsibility, none, for the violence, instead blames the victim. So in that 20%, what the victim needs to do in terms of a safety plan to get out is, first of all, make copies of all the important documents that are around. If she owns with her partner a house or property or a car or anything else, make copies of that. make copies of insurance, make copies of birth certificates, marriage certificates, any financial bank statements, assets, and so on. Make copies of that and keep those out of the house. Keep them separately, maybe at a friend's house, something like that, where the perpetrator cannot find them. Spare set of keys, have those also. It's almost like a emergency bag, you know, how we prepare with bottles of water and canned food and incidentally a can opener. So very important to have the supplies you need elsewhere, some clothing, children's clothing, and so on. And create a plan. Typically, what works best is working with a counselor, a therapist, or somebody at an agency, a social worker perhaps, who can guide you as to where you can go if you leave. And make sure you have a place where there's either security, a security system involved, which might be a shelter, for example, a domestic violence shelter, or at another person's home who the perpetrator does not know and cannot identify. And make a plan to go, of course, when the perpetrator is not at home. Don't do it in the middle of the night when the perpetrator is there. So it's really about careful planning. But, you know, I think the most important piece of someone getting away from a perpetrator is psychological preparation. Mm-hmm. In other words, oftentimes these people have heard that they're at fault, the victims, so many times that they believe it. They've internalized that message. So what can really help is for them to talk to a counselor or a clergy or someone who can say, no, this isn't your fault. And if anybody says it is, get out of there and find somebody else who can say, this isn't your fault. You didn't do this, no matter what you said. That does not lay the blame at your feet for being battered in the corner of the house.
Yeah.
It's very important to have that psychological preparation.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And if somebody is getting what's called gaslighted, where their reality is being denied, also known as crazy making,
right? Mm-hmm.
How do they address that? Because not always do they have the ability to get away from the multiple people who might be doing that to them, not just the perpetrator.
Yeah, that's a really good question. What Neil Jacobson and I discovered in doing exit interviews with women who did get away was that they kind of gave up the dream that these men would change. And there was usually a last straw incident that happened where they either felt in danger of their lives or felt that they couldn't leave their children with this person in charge. And this last straw incident really convinced them that they had to do something that removed themselves and their children from the influence of this person who was gaslighting them. And that really required believing that you're entitled to live a life where you don't get hit and you don't get controlled. And so it's that internal change that was really necessary, giving up that dream that these men would change. And one thing that's characteristic of these particular guys where there is a perpetrator and a victim is they take no responsibility at all for the violence and think that the victim's words, justify the physical violence. And when that pattern exists, then the woman, or a man, if a man is victimized by a woman, needs to get away, or a man victimized by a man. So all genders, all combinations of sexual orientation, domestic violence is an issue. Mm-hmm. And so nobody deserves to get hit for any reason.
The other thing about gaslighting is that it's actually very common, not only in physically abusive relationships, but emotionally abusive relationships also. And what can really help is to identify somebody who can reflect back to you your own reality and question what the perpetrator is trying to convince you is true.
Right.
So that person can say something like, okay, so you remember a picture hanging on the wall in that place, and now your partner is saying there never was a picture there, there never was a portrait of your daughter there. Have you looked at the wall carefully to see whether the color where the picture sat is different than the color around where you think the picture sat? And oftentimes they'll say, no. Okay, well, let me suggest you go back there and look. And sure enough, what they'll find is that the space where the picture sat is lighter than the picture, or darker, one or the other, than the surrounding color where the picture was. That tells them, wait a minute, I'm being lied to. I'm being lied to.
That's from the original movie Gaslight.
That's right.
So
it's
people should watch
example.
that. Yeah.
It's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a fabulous, it's a, what is it, a Hitchcock movie? But anyway, it's terrific.
Yeah, that's the original. That's from the original Gaslight movie, and it's a really good example of how these characterologically violent men, or physically abusive, psychologically abusive men, often deny reality, their partner's reality, and it's an effort to really control the mind of the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, keep them kind of held down. And I think about the baby elephant in the circus that would be tied up with a rope to a stake, and it couldn't move. And then when it became an adult, just having the rope around its leg, even if it wasn't tied to anything, it would still think it was not able to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's called learned helplessness.
Yes.
Found by a guy named Martin Seligman, who studied that regarding depression, many years ago, and discovered that even if you put an animal in a cage with a slight shock in the floor of that cage, and the animal can't get out, gets used to having to endure the shock, and then you open the door, the animal doesn't leave. It stays there because that's what it's accustomed to. Same thing with domestic violence victims. So they really need, again, that support to help them overcome what the perpetrator has taught them, that they are powerless. That's the message they've gotten. They're powerless. They can't do anything without the perpetrator's okay. Well, not true. So they really do have agency over their own life, and they can leave if they want to. They just have to be careful in doing so to protect themselves, protect their children, protect their pets too.
Right. And would you say that oftentimes they have to hit rock bottom, like that event that happens that finally convinces them is almost like a rock bottom event, like somebody who's maybe addicted to drugs or alcohol has to hit rock bottom before they realize, like, I need rehab?
Sometimes I think that is true. There's kind of a last straw, as John was talking about. But I also think for others, I mean, it's a matter of luck in the sense of who else is in their lives.
Yeah.
And what's happening if they have children. Do they have children who are getting beaten up? Because they'll leave for the children sometimes rather than themselves. So, there's other factors involved, but certainly that's one of them.
Yeah. Would you say that it's possible to get somebody who's the perpetrator into some sort of anger management program to get them to change, or do you just have to kind of figure they're not going to ever change?
We just don't know. Believe it or not, there's essentially no funding to do research on this population. There used to be funding from the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Mental Health, but now there are just no grants available to study domestic violence, even though it's the number one problem in love relationships on the planet. And yet there's no priority to do research on this topic. One of my former students, and Neil Jacobson's former student, Julie Babcock, at the University of Houston, has been trying to get grants, for 20 years in this area, and there just aren't any grant opportunities to study this. We think that there's a way to help these perpetrators.
We do.
And we have a little bit of evidence, Julia Babcock and I, that we can really reach them and that we can understand their psychology and what motivates them. But, we really have to be able to do the research and do the gold standard kind of treatment where we have a control group and an experimental group. And for that, you really need a laboratory and you need, a research grant to fund it. So it needs to be made a priority by the federal government in order to do research in this area.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath for that one.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, but the good news, though, Stephen, is that we have done research on treating situational domestic violence.
Right.
So we did a big study where the treatment consisted of small groups of couples, say 5 or 6 couples, meeting every week for 2 hours with 2 facilitators for about 20 weeks or so. And what we did was a combination of things. We worked very hard on creating group connection. So we knew that the couples would connect with each other and come back week after week. That's what we really wanted to strengthen. And in addition, we gave them teachings, little teachings and exercises to do to change the skills as well as their deeper understanding of their partners, of themselves, and of how to deal with conflict, as well as how to build friendship, connection, passion, and romance. That group was compared to a group that did not receive that kind of treatment. And there were, I forget, maybe 70, 80 couples in each of the treatment and non-treatment cohorts. And what we found is that at the end of that 20 weeks, up to 1.5 years later, where we did follow-up research, we had eliminated domestic violence entirely. We also decreased hostility, we increased conflict management skills, we deepened friendship. And a very important part of this program involved teaching the couples with a little device called the M-Wave.
A biofeedback device.
EMWAVE, created by a company called Heart Math, that taught couples how to calm down, how to immediately self-soothe within 5 minutes. And we only used it 5 minutes a week with each partner in the group, in the groups that received treatment. And we think that that had a lot to do with it too. They were able to calm down their physiological flooding much more effectively. And that in itself would have really helped stop domestic violence.
And one thing I want to add to that is that what we discovered in the research that Neil Jacobson and I did and we used in this intervention was it's not enough to just focus on the management of conflict for couples who experience domestic violence. You have to also teach skills for building intimacy and emotional connection. That's a big part of it. So it's not just avoiding conflict. A lot of times conflict is a stand-in for not being able to connect emotionally in a positive way, not being able to court and romance your partner or play together or have adventure together. So building those positive connections is as important as skills for dealing with conflict.
What a great point. It reminds me of in parenting, the child who doesn't get positive attention would act out to get negative attention because it's so much better than nothing at all.
That's right. Exactly.
Precisely.
That's exactly the point, Stephanie. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And a lot of times intervention programs for domestic violence only focus on the violence and the conflict.
Or the guy.
Yeah, or the guy. And none of those programs have been shown to be effective. They're all ineffective.
Wow. And so what's the program that you would recommend folks go to, couples go to, where they're experiencing any kind of situational domestic violence?
Well, at the Gottman Institute, we have a program called Couples Together Against Violence. It hasn't been released to the public yet, but I do believe that if people can do it on their own in terms of going to our Art and Science of Love online workshop at the Gottman Institute, which helps people learn conflict management skills as well as those deepening friendship skills. So they're all the same things, as well as how to process a regrettable incident, which is a very important thing to be able to do. So you're not, continually festering about a past conflict that you've suffered from. You can recover from it. The other thing they might want to do is anything that can help them learn how to self-soothe. For example, meditation, any kind of meditation or mindfulness training is fabulous for really changing your physiology so you don't get triggered so easily and you can calm down much more rapidly. Doing yoga, figuring out how to self-soothe is really key to stopping domestic violence, at least the situational domestic violence.
Yeah.
Right. So that the kind of breathing where you develop heart-brain coherence.
That's right.
Breathe in 5 seconds, breathe out 5 seconds, etc. That can really help. Even just 5 minutes of that can make a big difference.
Breathing is a big part of it. Yes.
Right. Or breathe out to a count of 8. So make it a little bit longer breathing out.
Right. Now you said something about processing a regrettable incident. What does that entail?
So processing a regrettable incident, first of all, carries a couple of assumptions when you're actually doing the processing itself. One is you have to be in a calm state. It's not something you can do immediately after something has happened. You've got to wait a little bit till you're calm. 2, you have to assume that there are 2 points of view in every fight or regrettable incident, and they're both right. There is no absolute reality. It's really all about perception. Couples make the mistake of trying to compete on who remembers the incident better. So it becomes a win-lose power struggle. That doesn't work. There's always 2 points of view. And the goal of processing a regrettable incident is really to understand your partner's point of view as well as feel understood yourself when you express your own. So the state of mind you have to be in is something like being in the upper balcony of a theater after the 2 of you have watched Act 1 of a play. It's now intermission, and you're discussing what happened during Act 1. So there are 5 steps to this exercise, and one has to really follow them to the letter. The first one is, and you can get all of this material from the Gottman Institute. You can also get it from Affective Software, from that Gottman Connect, which has everything downloadable too, which is great. The first step, you say what feelings you had during the incident. And all you're doing is reading from a list of feelings which ones you had. And you can name as many as you want. In the second, and each of you takes a turn doing that, in the second step, you state your perceptions of what happened. You tell the story of your experience, but you do it without blame or criticism. Instead, you say, here's what I heard, here's what I felt, here's what I saw on your face, here's what I imagined you were thinking. This was my fantasy. Here's what I then said, what I did, what I felt. You describe that. Your partner, meanwhile, who's listening, is taking notes, not bringing up their own point of view. They're taking notes so that when you're done, they can summarize what they heard you say to make sure they got the most important points, and then say a few words of validation like, okay, I get it. If I were you, if I stepped into your shoes, that would make sense to me. I understand. Now, that doesn't mean they agree with the person's perception, just means that if they were that person, they could understand how they felt. Then it's their turn to share their point of view while the first person takes notes, summarizes, and validates. The third piece is they each have a turn talking about if they had any feelings triggered. And by triggered, what I mean, what triggers are feelings that got started long before this relationship ever began. Feelings that may have gotten started in childhood or in an earlier relationship, like exclusion, being judged, being shamed, being humiliated, being abandoned, being rejected. Those kinds of feelings that we carry inside of us as baggage, quote unquote, can get triggered during current events. So, and then they get magnified by the history around that feeling. So each person says if they got any feelings triggered, those old feelings, and tells a story from their past before this relationship of when that feeling occurred earlier in their lives. Then the fourth step, notice how late this comes, you start taking responsibility. You take responsibility for your part in this by saying what you regret saying or doing during the fight specifically, and you apologize for it. Each person takes a turn at that. Also citing what their state of mind was too. I was stressed, I was too sensitive, whatever. And then in step 5, each person looks to the future and says one thing they can do differently themselves and one thing their partner can do differently to avoid something like this from happening again. Now, when everybody goes through all of this, and it can take a long time, 1 to 2 hours maybe, almost everyone reports, wow, it doesn't bother me anymore. I remember what happened, but it doesn't carry the same electricity, the same charge that it did before. And then they can go on in their lives.
And regrettable incidents are inevitable in all relationships.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, this is such a powerful process. It reminds me a little bit of Imago Dialogues. I had Harville Hendricks and Helen Kelly Hunt on this podcast, and we went through the Imago Dialogue on that. And it also reminds me a little bit of Ho'oponopono, the forgiveness process from ancient Hawaiian culture, and but with some really important distinctions. Right. I think this is really, really powerful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah. All right. So I know we're about out of time here. So if you could share a couple of resources, website URLs, or social profiles or something that our listener can then access and follow after this, after hearing this episode, this amazing, beautiful, and powerful episode, what would you send them to?
Well, one thing that I want to tell people about is that if they go to the App Store and type Gottman card decks, then they can download a free app that has 14 different card decks that they can play with, asking open-ended questions to get to know your partner better, building an erotic map of your partner's world by asking 100 different questions of a man, 100 different questions you can ask a woman, the expressing needs card deck where you can talk about what you need from your partner this week. And these are all free. They've been downloaded 350,000 times now. So that's one thing that is free and available.
Right. You can also go to Gottman Connect, which has fantastic modules that you can download. They're really cool, where John and I talk about a particular exercise, then we role play. There are videotapes on it. We role play how not to do it and how to do it, just for some fun. And give lots of instruction and text and so on, so people can really hone their skills in every domain of their relationship, including sexuality. And you can buy our latest book, which is 8 Dates, Essential Conversations for a Lifetime of Love, that really contain, each chapter focuses on what kinds of topics to discuss and particular questions to ask one another that pertain to parenting, conflict, how you like conflict to go, trust, spirituality, play and adventure. What else is in there? Dreams, your future dreams. So it's just really lovely in terms
great
of
dates.
in terms of really deepening your connection with one another and understanding each other better. And of course, there is our kind of foundational place for all things Gottman, which is Gottman.com.
Wonderful.
Hey,
Thank you,
well,
Stephan.
thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous. And listener, please take advantage of this important information and apply it in your life. And we'll catch you in the next episode.